In today's world, multinational tech giants control our information, Wall Street firms manipulate trillions of dollars, and private defense contractors wield state-of-the-art weaponry. We often worry whether these ultra-wealthy corporations have become too powerful. But what if you took all of it, the capital of modern tech giants, the private army of a massive military contractor, and the taxing power of an entire nation, and rolled them into a single company? What would that look like? By the end of the 18th century, one company possessed a private army of over 260,000 men. That was twice the size of the British sovereign army at the time. It ruled over 1/5 of the world's population, controlled the global supply chains of the most lucrative commodities, and held the supreme right to wage private wars, mint currency, and annex territories in the East. This was the Honorable East India Company. Today, we tend to view it simply as the vanguard of British colonial expansion. But from an economic and business perspective, it was a pure capitalist monster. It proved to the world what happens when the power of capital is completely unregulated and fuses with state-sanctioned violence. How did a company founded by a few London merchants for the spice trade evolve over 2 centuries into a corporate state that controlled an entire subcontinent? To understand the rise of the East India Company, we must travel back to the final day of the year, 1600. At the time, England was merely a second-rate island nation on the fringes of Europe. In the highly profitable global spice trade, Portugal and the Netherlands had already taken the lead. For merchants of that era, sailing to the East Indies, modern-day India and Southeast Asia, was an absolute gamble. A wooden sailing ship had to navigate treacherous oceans for over 6 months, facing piracy, scurvy, and armed attacks from rival nations. The rates of shipwreck and death were staggeringly high. If a ship sank, the merchants who financed the voyage would face instant ruin, often landing their entire families in debtor's prison. High risk meant no single investor dared to stake everything. To solve this critical bottleneck, the East India Company introduced a disruptive commercial innovation that altered human economic history forever: limited liability and the joint stock formula. Instead of relying on a single wealthy patron, the company issued shares of stock to the London public. Anyone, from aristocrats and politicians to local tavern owners, could buy a piece of the company. If the voyage made a profit, everyone received a dividend proportional to their investment. If the ship sank, an investor's loss was strictly limited to the amount they spent on their shares. They were not liable for any additional debts. This model successfully diluted immense systemic risk across a society-wide pool of capital. It instantly transformed the savings of ordinary citizens into the fuel for global expansion. This became the blueprint for modern stock exchanges and multinational corporations. But capital alone wasn't enough. The East India Company also secured the ultimate competitive advantage from the version Marinin. Inichuas, Bar Isir Erdefran, Bernin Ashwarin. Urmauzuni, a royal charter issued by Queen Elizabeth I. This charter granted the East India Company an absolute monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. This meant that if any other English merchant dared to trade a single pound of tea or spice from India, it was strictly illegal. With an infinite source of capital and a state-backed monopoly, the company's foundational business code was set. Next, it would bare its teeth. Initially, the East India Company played by the rules in India. They established trading posts along the coast, using European silver to buy Indian textiles and spices. But soon, commercial competition escalated into armed conflict to counter French and Dutch rivals, as well as uncooperative local Indian rulers. The company began recruiting local Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, to build its own private army. The historic turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. Robert Clive, a ruthless agent of the company, used bribery, political intrigue, and superior military tactics to defeat the forces of the Nawab of Bengal. While celebrated as a military victory, it was in reality a spectacularly successful corporate takeover. Following the battle, the Mughal emperor was forced to sign a treaty granting the East India Company the Diwani, the right to collect all agricultural and trade taxes across the wealthy region of Bengal. This marked the most critical and dangerous mutation in corporate history. On this day, the East India Company transitioned from earning profits through trading to earning revenue through taxing. Bengal was one of the richest agricultural and manufacturing centers in the world. Now, the taxes generated by the labor of millions of Indian farmers and artisans bypassed the local treasury and flowed directly into the balance sheets of a publicly traded company in London. The company had discovered a perfect, closed-loop system of economic extraction. First, collect taxes in India to secure massive amounts of free cash flow. Next, use that exact tax revenue to buy Indian goods like cotton and tea. Then, ship these commodities to Europe and sell them for an absolute fortune. Finally, use those massive profits to expand the private army, conquer more land, and collect even more taxes. Under this logic, the company didn't even need to spend its own capital to purchase goods. They used Indian taxes to buy Indian products and then sold them to the rest of the world. The East India Company was no longer just a business. It had become a predatory corporate parasite ruling an empire. By the late 18th century, the East India Company had engineered the most sophisticated and lucrative global supply chain in human history. Yet, behind this massive machine lay a fatal vulnerability in its balance sheet. At the time, British society developed an insatiable obsession with Chinese tea. From aristocratic salons to working-class homes, afternoon tea became a national necessity. The East India Company monopolized this trade, shipping millions of pounds of tea back to Britain each year and generating massive profits. The problem, however, was that the Chinese Qing dynasty maintained a strict, isolationist trade policy. Furthermore, China was entirely self-sufficient and had zero interest in European manufactured goods like wool or clocks. Chinese merchants accepted only one form of currency: silver. This created a severe trade deficit for Britain. To secure tea, the East India Company had to drain its reserves, paying out massive amounts of silver to China every year. Over time, this silver drain threatened to bankrupt the company's cash reserves. To plug this silver loophole, the company's managers exposed the coldest, most calculating side of capital. They engineered a triangular trade model that would become one of the most infamous operations in history. First, the company forced Indian farmers to stop growing food crops and instead cultivate poppies for opium production. Next, the company used independent smugglers to flood the Chinese market with this illicit opium. Finally, the massive amounts of silver paid by Chinese buyers for the drug flowed directly into the East India Company's accounts, which the company immediately used to buy tea for the British market. Within this loop, the East India Company did not have to spend a single coin of its own silver. They financed their tea empire entirely through the illicit drug trade, draining China's wealth while satisfying Britain's cultural demand. From a purely operational standpoint, it was a flawless optimization of a supply chain. But from a human perspective, it was an absolute catastrophe. It undermined China's economy and social fabric, ultimately sparking the Opium Wars. Simultaneously, it devastated India's agricultural infrastructure. The once fertile breadbasket of Bengal was forcibly converted into a narcotics factory, setting the stage for the company's ultimate downfall. When a corporation's sole driving force becomes absolute profit, it invites its own destruction. The East India Company's hyper-extraction in India quickly triggered severe systemic risks. The first consequence was a catastrophic social crisis, because the company forced farmers to grow cash crops instead of grain while aggressively collecting exorbitant land taxes. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 erupted, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. Yet, during the height of the famine, company officials enforced full tax collections to protect their quarterly profits and personal commissions. This ruthless neglect incited deep resentment in India and sparked outrage among the public in Britain. The second consequence was rampant internal corruption and a subsequent financial crisis. This became a textbook example of the principal-agent problem. While company executives on the ground amassed vast personal fortunes, returning to Britain to buy grand estates and buy off politicians, the parent company itself groaned under massive debt caused by soaring military expenditures and administrative mismanagement. By 1772, this seemingly invincible corporate giant was on the brink of default, unable to pay its bills or its army. This threw the British government into a panic. The East India Company had become too integrated into the nation's economy. Its stock formed the core asset of countless British aristocrats and banks. If it collapsed, it threatened to drag the entire British financial system down with it. This was the birth of the concept, too big to fail. The British government had no choice but to bail out the East India Company using taxpayer funds. However, this rescue came at a steep price. The state began systematically stripping away the company's privileges, appointing regulatory oversight boards, restricting its private military actions, and gradually dismantling its trade monopolies. The final day of reckoning arrived in 1857. Driven by decades of economic exploitation and cultural friction, the Indian soldiers employed by the company staged a massive, widespread rebellion. This uprising nearly toppled corporate rule entirely. To restore order, the British government had to deploy its own sovereign military forces to crush the rebellion. In the aftermath of the war, the British Parliament realized that leaving the destiny of an empire in the hands of a profit-driven corporation was a catastrophic error. In 1858, the government passed an act formally stripping the East India Company of its administrative powers, transferring direct rule of India to the British Crown. In 1874, the company that had lasted for 274 years and redrawn the map of the world was formally dissolved in a modest office in London. The East India Company is gone, but its commercial DNA remains embedded in the core of our modern global economy. The concepts we take for granted today, limited liability, global supply chain management, cross-border capital flows, and the aggressive corporate lobbying of political institutions, all trace their lineage back to the single 17th century enterprise. It stands as a permanent warning in economic history. It demonstrates the raw nature of capital, an insatiable drive for endless expansion and profit. When that power is left entirely unchecked by law and morality, and when it acquires the tools of state-sanctioned violence, a corporation can easily transform into a leviathan that dictates terms to nations and citizens alike. Today, as we watch modern tech giants amass wealth greater than many countries, manage core data for billions of people, and write the rules for the digital age, we must ask ourselves, has that history truly ended? Or is a new iteration of the East India Company already quiet at work all around us?